This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com. I have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, prolific writer on the web, certainly well recognized by most and a frequent visitor here at Macro Analytics. Charles is the publisher of the website Of Two Minds. Charles, welcome to Macro Analytics, and I guess this is the first time we've had a chance to look at your smiling face.
For better or for worse.
Yeah, well, it's something. We'll try it. So I hope our listeners can bear with us here today. We've got the same format with the slides. I'd like your backdrop. I like the backdrop. It looks Chinese to me or something. Asian.
Right. Yeah. It's the Japanese shoji screen to hide the mess in my home office.
Oh, is that what it's for? Okay. now we know. Charles, I'm going to move right to that we've put together this morning, so we don't run out of time. And I'll come back to your smiling face here, but I wanted really to touch base, and it's going to be a little different than normal. Usually you bring the slides. This morning, I guess I'm bringing the slides, and I'd like your feedback on them as we go through them, and comments that you could make. A lot of materials we've touched on in various forms. Various shows we've had together, but it's becoming really blatant of the degree and what it's going to mean, what I think is this next crisis. And that is, the bottom line is we have moved to a subprime economy. And we heard those discussions back in 2007 when we were talking about subprime mortgages and subprime lending. But I believe right now that the bulk of the United States economy is moving into that subprime category, whether the credit companies want to call it that or not. And that is whether it's through the magnitude of student loans and their parents and the debts that they have and their ability to handle it, the increasing car buyers and how they're financing the cars, and the size it is of disposable income, and the retail stores and the amount of investment that it is now has made, and the problems that it's facing. Remembering that all this ties together, that the United States is a 70% consumption economy. And when the consumer starts to get tapped out in these areas and doesn't have the money, it's going to bring the economy to knees very, very quickly. And I believe that's already happening.
Well said, Gordon. And this slide that you have up on the growth of the family income is a critical part of this, is that wages and earned income have stagnated for roughly 40 years. And as a result, this vast consumer economy has relied more and more on debt. And what has happened as incomes from the bottom 90% stagnate is the quality of that debt keeps deteriorating. In other words, to sell something, retailers and car manufacturers are selling more and more to marginal borrowers, people who wouldn't qualify for a loan under rigorous risk management.
Exactly, Charles. This chart is just shows how dramatic that shift has been. And when you translate it, and this one is put together by Dave Stockman, and I annotated it over. And he was a congressman, and he was a head director of the OMB budget. So he's not a man that just blatantly pulls numbers out of the air. But it's all of this is leading that the breadwinner jobs themselves have been steadily falling off. And if you look at it, 48% of all the new jobs that we've been creating are paying less than $24,000 a year. I don't know what mortgages are like in San Francisco, or rentals for that matter. Everybody's rental, but an apartment here, you're lucky if you can get one for under $1,600 a month. So even $1,000 a month, that's $12,000 a year on a $24,000 gross. It doesn't compute. How do you live?
Yeah, and I think we just saw in the latest jobs report that the full-time jobs have stagnated. There's 118 million full-time jobs. That is roughly the same level as a decade ago. So all the jobs that have been added are marginal. They're all low income, part-time, and you cannot support a household on that
Yeah,
type of income.
that's the. I think all our listeners are aware of that. But that's the story that the politicians won't touch when they talk about job growth. The job growth is terrible, but it's worse than that. It's the wrong kind of jobs. They can't support the population, and more people are falling further and further behind. If they're lucky to get a 2% increase, inflation at the store, we all know, is substantially more than that. So after 2 or 3 years, that adds up. It adds up dramatically, and that's the compression that we're under. But if we look at the lending that's going on right now, the lending growth that we have is strictly student loans and car loans. That is where all the credit has been sustained, and that's because these are considered no choice. You don't have a car, you can't get to work. You can't be a soccer mom. You've got to have a car, and without an education and the cost that goes with it, you feel like you've got no choice. It's forced expenditures at a shrinking disposable income.
Right, and I think that the really pernicious parts of the student loan bubble are, number one, its tremendous size, $1.2 trillion dollars in student loans, and it's rising fast. And but what are you getting for this enormous expense? Well, it turns out that, as we've discussed in previous programs, the college education simply doesn't guarantee the security and income that it did 30 years ago. So you're getting an inferior product that no longer relates to the real economy, and you are a debt serf in the sense that you have enormous student loans that you cannot pay off on your $24,000 a year job.
So the only thing that's rising faster than the student loans is the non-performing element of the delinquencies of the student loans. And so what happens when they graduate? They can't get jobs. They can't get jobs at a pay that supports them. We've got the definition of subprime. So all of the students and their parents are being pushed into being really effectively subprime lenders. And that means that the risks that go with it. And our whole way we're financing this, and we'll talk a little bit later, through the shadow banking system, is all based on whether there's residual values. Remember what crumbled the stock market, or the 2008 crisis on the mortgages, was that the housing stopped going up and delinquencies started rising, and then it set in the panic, because in the shadow banking you lend short and borrow long, and so it froze up. And this can happen very quickly, again, because this time it's about student loans through Sallie Mae, 1.2, 1.4 trillion. It's car loans, it's retail loans, etc. Because these car loans, I don't know about you, Charles, but have you noticed that tow trucks that go by now aren't called tow trucks anymore? They're called towing and recovery? Or is that just an East Coast kind of thing?
I haven't heard that, but it makes sense.
Well, it is. You just check. They're all called towing and recovery, and the reason is they're making more money doing recovery than they are towing. I go for my walk every morning, and what you see is they've been out all night, because there's this donut shop where I do a turnaround on my morning run, and they're lined up in there because they've been working all night, grabbing a coffee, whatever, and then they're quitting for the go get some sleep, because they've been doing recovery, and recovering is repossessions, repos. And that's where the money is, and it's almost transparent to everybody. We don't see that it's going on. Of course, we're not, we're sleeping, and they're out doing repos, but they're even doing it during the day. And it's because these car loans, we've sold, if you look at the current numbers here this month, we're running at a rate of 16.9 million new cars. We haven't been at this, on an annualized rate, we haven't been at this level since 2006, when we were using all this funny HELOC money to do the financing. So where's all this money coming from that allows anybody to get a car, and our cars at this level? And look at these, where the analysis, this was done by a group at the University of Chicago, is being sold to high zip code, or to poor zip code areas, poor being, that is, having high default rates. It's clearly a clear correlation. Your sense on that, Charles?
Well, Gordon, you told me a story based on your own experience last month that I think was worth recounting, that I think encapsulates the reason why there's so many auto sales to marginal buyers. And I think the story was you saw parking lots filled with new cars, and you wondered how people could afford these.
Well, exactly. I was with my wife, and we were going into a mall, and there was beside it, there was this massive dollar store, one of some Dollar Family, one of these. And the people that were coming out of the store, what caught my attention was I didn't realize in those places the amount of food that they sell. I thought it was dollar items. But they were coming out with shopping carts full of what I'll call basics of life, whether it was toilet paper, but basic foodstuffs, etc. So it kind of caught my attention. I didn't realize that that's what was the degree at which was being sold there. But as I was noticing that, what I noticed is they were all getting in new cars. And not opulent cars. I'm not talking about that, but all basically brand new cars. And I turned to my wife and I said to her, I says, how can they afford new cars? And she says, well, what else do you think they can afford? And I thought I missed something. What are you talking about? She says, that's all they can afford. And I says, all they can afford is a new car? She says, yes. Well, my wife is involved in the hospital nursing home industry, et cetera, and a consultant. The biggest issue they face all the time is people not showing up for work is because they're out of miles. And I said, what do you mean they're out of miles? She says, well, because they can't afford to buy a car anymore, so they get a $99 or $199 a month lease, less monthly payment, hardly any money down, but still money down on those. But the restrictions is on the leases so many miles a year. Well, they run out of miles very quickly, and the penalties are phenomenal. So these people that are working 1 and 2 and 3 jobs this subprime, trying to pull it together, they run out of miles and they can't come to work. So they're scrambling to try and figure out who they can get in that can get to work. And I said, I can't believe it. And she says, because if they were to buy a used car, the cost of the maintenance, anything in it's $500 or $1,000. And she says, so they got a new car. The worst they're going to have to do is possibly oil changes and maybe tire change. She said, so they feel that their maintenance is gone. And I talked to people in the garages, and their business is just down dramatically. If it wasn't for General Motors recall, some of them would have nothing to do. Well, I'll tell you one other story on this, Charles. And this just happened the other day. A guy, the person who owns this complex that I'm in, well-to-do, son's going off to college, trying to make sure that this child is not growing up with a silver spoon in his mouth. But his wife doesn't want the son being off in an old beat-up car driving to college. So they think he needs a new car to go to college. But the father's not going to pay for it. He wants to make sure that he's responsible. So he said to the son, you pick up the car, you figure out how to finance it, you figure out what you're going to do, and I'll go with you. Because he knows that at the end of the day, father's going to have to co-sign the loan on the car. But he wants to teach him how to negotiate and the responsibilities. Well, he came into my office, the father, plopped down. He says, Gord, explain how this happened, how this can be. He says, I went with him. He found a car. He bought a Mustang, $31,500. We were there 2 hours. All he showed him was his driver's license, and he drove off with that brand new car. He says, I didn't co-sign. I never opened my mouth. I was just a spectator. And I hire him every summer when he's going to be going, or do have been, and when he goes through college, and I know he can't afford it. I'm going to have to bail him out. But he walked out of there with that car. It's get an ass in the seat. That's what's going on. It's because they're passing these, the same as they did with mortgages. They're passing them on, these loans on as fast as they can, the banks, etc.
Well, Gordon, those stories are really striking. And what comes to my mind is two things. One is that the risk in the system is piling up. Exactly. And even though we don't see it, when you're making most of your sales to marginal buyers who would not qualify for this debt under any sort of prudent risk management, when the defaults start, then it is going to be like a row of dominoes falling. And I think, and one other quick point is, the interest rates that a lot of these marginal borrowers are paying, it's not 1 or 2%. That may be the teaser loan on the credit card, but the credit cards are often quickly go to 17, 18, 20%. The auto loans jump up. Student loans can be 7 or 8%. It's not 1%. So these people are paying through the nose for money that's been borrowed from the Fed at basically 0%.
What's going to bring this down is the same as what happened with the housing. Let's just pick on cars here because we're talking about. All these people are buying new cars. So what happens to all the used cars? What happens when the cars come off lease? Because all these leases are priced on a residual value. Well, if you go to the auctions now, there's cars as far as the eye can see that they're trying to move wholesale that the car lots won't touch. So quickly, all these people, like in the mortgage, are going to have to bring down the residual values, the values of the house, loan to value, but they're going to have to bring them down. And suddenly all that money, and as they realize, which is being borrowed short, lent long on the car lease, but they're floating that money out of short-term repos in the shadow banking system. When they suddenly realize what we're talking about, the degree, because it's already sinking in, that's what'll set off the panic. That's what set off the panic before. But at that time, it was an asset-backed commercial paper, which stopped, and we don't do that anymore. It'll be the same thing here. So you've got it going on in student loans when they realize they can't pay them back. The car loans, it's going to end up with the residual values because there just isn't going to be that many buyers of these used cars. And comments on that, Charles?
Oh no, go right ahead.
I was going to switch gears because they're going to say these are all consumers that are tapped out and playing this game. If you look at the retail, the stores, and you and I have done a number of audios or tapes on what's going on in the entire U.S. retail commercial real estate space, because of the advancing technologies, the ability to reduce the floor space in the stores. You don't need it as much because everybody's going online. You know, I come to my neighborhood in the morning, I come home from work, and there's all sorts of parcels on everybody's doorstep that the brown box, the UPSs have delivered all day. They're not out, so if they're buying, they're not buying from the stores. And so that retail space, and we're seeing the consumer slowing down. And I've actually seen, Charles, very clear longer term, when you adjust it, head and shoulders as we're starting to roll over in the United States in total consumption because of this squeeze. And then you're seeing more and more of these stores that are being shut down regularly, and they're discount stores. Because and so the remaining ones are having to compete. They're having to figure out how to get down their floor space, et cetera. And I was just looking at the GDP numbers. Q1 we had a negative 2.9% GDP, and the first 2 months of the second quarter is worse than the first 2 months of Q1. So Q2 may not be as low as 2.9, but to me, it looks like it's certainly going to be sub-zero. That's 2 consecutive quarters negative. I think we have a name for that, don't we, Charles?
There's an R word, I believe.
Yeah, we're not allowed to use that in public. But when the market starts to realize that we may be facing, and by the way, recessions happen every 5 years, so it's not unspeakable. And maybe that'll be the auspices by which the Fed will print more money and reverse taper or whatever, because my work with Richard Duncan says that they desperately are going to have a serious liquidity issue in the second half. Though they are camouflaging it, Charles, with reverse repo game that they're playing right now to the tune of about 150 billion. That's a whole discussion in itself. They're playing fancy games with buying through Belgium and reverse repos to buy more time. But whether they get another quarter, time will tell.
Well, Gordon, let's take that thought and move it over toward the limitations on income. In other words, what we're really talking about here in a secular systemic way is debt is dependent on income. And if the income doesn't grow, the debt can only grow by lowering the interest rate. And then once you've played that game, you've run out of growth. And I think that's where the U.S. economy is, that the consumer's tapped out. They've already borrowed as much as they can possibly borrow for auto loans, student loans, credit cards, you name it. And so there's no more income to support debt. And I wanted to ask you real quickly, isn't it true that the lenders are bundling up the auto loans and student loans and securitizing them just like they did with subprime mortgages?
Precisely. Exactly. All 3 of the things we just talked about, and whether the students, whether the cars, or whether the retails through REITs, real estate investment trusts, all of these loans whether they're bad loans, and vast majority of them are really bad loans, are immediately repackaged, securitized, and then resold off because they have a higher yield, the same as we were doing with mortgages. This is the chart I have up here, and this can be very complex, but I'll just make it really simple so we understand that nothing's changed. We've just changed the product versus mortgages is a new gig. And all these acronyms on the left-hand side under 2008, we don't use those anymore because those were bad, Charles. Those caused us a problem. But today, if you get into the same conversation, we have a whole series of new names. Minor wordsmithing, but it's the same gig, except the one on the right is working under the three areas that we just talked about. And so the short-term borrowing was, I mentioned earlier, on the left was asset-backed commercial paper. Today it's the repos. And to make that, without boring people with what these repos are, what we were doing before to make bad debt look good is we packaged them with credit default swaps, therefore were sold as AAA ratings. You remember all of that?
Yes.
Well, today what we do is we take this toxic stuff and we put something called a collateral transformation. Our banks are just so clever at figuring out how to do it. And they package it with it so they can turn these into repo equivalents, which means the insurance companies, pension plans, etc., can all buy these products. This time they're asset-backed securities, ABSs versus mortgage-backed securities, and they move them out as collateralized loan obligations. And they have some other really clever little protection in there that they didn't have before, which makes the insurance companies and the pensions really jump on them a little bit heavier. But the problem is, it's always the same. They're borrowing short term, 1 week, 5 weeks, 10 weeks on these repos, but they're lending out to your car payment, which is 4 years. So what happens if the money gets tight in a liquidity problem? You're within 90 days of financial bankruptcy. So they've got to keep the liquidity at a phenomenal rate. And aren't we trying to slow down liquidity? Isn't that what taper's about? Impossible. Not possible. We have to continue to accelerate it because we're talking about a $72 trillion size of the shadow banking system. They're caught. They're caught in a no-win game, and this is the only way to keep things going. But this bubble is going to break unless you believe all these students are going to pay their loans and all these cars are going to continue to be sold and all this retail space is going to continue to expand. What am I missing, Charles?
Absolutely nothing. And I would just add that you're talking about the potential for a liquidity crisis that the Fed has to save the shadow banking system, more or less. But the other crisis we're also talking about is a collateral crisis, meaning that the repoed car will have lost 2/3 of its value. The student loan that has defaulted is worthless. And the empty mall is also worthless. So beneath the surface, there's a collateral crisis because none of this stuff is worth what it's listed on the lender's books.
Precisely. There's two parts to this collateral problem. One, malinvestment, which means it's incorrectly priced. And having said that, there's a shortage of collateral because all this collateral is being repledged multiple times, which is illegal in the equity market, but in the debt market they've been doing it. It's called rehypothecation. So if you've got a car that the bank or somebody holds a lien against that until they get their money. They have the collateral. You have the title, but they have the collateral. That is being reposted many, many times to secure credit within the shadow banking system. So if that collateral dries up with bad investment, it all comes cascading down. But right now, the banks don't lend because they can't find new, fresh collateral that they trust. There's not enough out there. That's what's limiting our growth right now. And we have 150 to 180 billion or trillion dollar debt market, and that at 5% is consuming $8 to $9 trillion of money, and we're not creating that in our GDP. Global GDP is around 72 trillion. And even if you believe that the ridiculous 3% growth rate that the IMF is, that's only $2.1 trillion. There's a $7 trillion issue that's being made up of expansion of the monetary base through the central banks. We all know that, 10 to 12 trillion. And the rest is coming in this growth of the shadow banking system that's went from, south of 50 trillion to north of 72 trillion here since the crisis began. So that's the gig. So they can't let credit slow, and they can't figure out ways of creating collateral, because lending money does not create wealth, and collateral is about pledging wealth. Too complex, Charles? Or?
No, absolutely not. And I think your last slide here brilliantly captures what we're really talking about, which is this is a repeat of the global credit crisis of 2008, 2009, and it's going to play out the same way because nothing has changed except the names. Like you said, it's sort of like the secret police in the old Soviet Union going from the NKVD to the KGB. Changing the acronym didn't change anything.
Yeah, the only thing that's different this time is they're not going to be as blindsided. So they're going to print the money and increase the liquidity at a faster rate. And you can be assured, you just saw Drahi pledge $1 trillion, or trillion euro, 1.4 trillion euros, $1 trillion US dollars. They know they have to increase it. And so they'll be a little faster off the mark. However, the collateral, this time it's global. And where the breakages could be, they may not be able to fix it as fast. So this is it can go on for, and you can expect it to go on for quite a period longer, Charles. This isn't imminent. But when it starts to come apart, it's going to be quite a travesty. Anyway, any closing comments? I gather you agree with most of these charts.
Absolutely, and I would just make one last comment, which is this is a global issue, as you say, and the stories of 40 million empty apartments in China, and the gold and commodities that have been pledged multiple times in Chinese warehouses, and then there's nothing in the warehouse. So these issues of subprime and no collateral are global.
Charles, always a pleasure. I hope our video didn't move around too much on everybody. I'll get a little bit better at this as we go along, but always enjoy talking to you. And we'll talk again next month.
Thank you, Gordon.
Talk to you then. Bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.
Always enjoy talking to you. And we'll talk again next month.
Thank you, Gordon.
Talk to you then. Bye.